Hi, everyone. Welcome to this evening's meeting. I'm Dennis Reardon, President of Connecticut. We're going to start with the land acknowledgement. Connecticut wishes to honor the indigenous communities native to the chapter area, including the Pagusset, Wepawag, Quinnipiac, Tucket, Connecticut, and Hammonasset people. As we advocate for conservation of the land and its wildlife, we're indebted to the work of the native and indigenous people who cherished the land for thousands of years before European colonization. And I want to draw your attention to a celebration that we're having on Saturday between 11 a.m. and 3 p.m. at our Urbanscapes Native Plant Nursery in New Haven. We're celebrating a successful summer at the nursery and the opening of our new greenhouse. There'll be big plant sale, activities for kids, turtles and snakes, information booths, foods, and a milk jug wildflower propagation workshop. The nursery is at 133 Hazel Street in New Haven, and this will be Saturday, 11 to 3. Hope to see you there. One of the gravest threats facing birds is climate change. And rising temperatures, according to Audubon's research, threaten nearly 2/3 of North America's bird species. That's why development of offshore wind is a good thing. And it can be developed in an environmentally responsible way. This evening, we'll hear from Shilo about Audubon's work in this area. And Dr. Shilo Felton is field manager for Audubon's Clean Energy Initiative. She has a doctorate from North Carolina State University in Fisheries, Wildlife, and Conservation Biology. Before joining Audubon, Shilo was principal wildlife biologist with the Rhode Island Department of Environmental Management. But for me, her most important credential is that during her research, she worked with my favorite bird, the American oyster catcher. So Shilo, welcome and take it away.
Well, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. My goodness, I hardly know what to say. I do want to thank you, Dennis, and thank all of you for inviting me to speak tonight to you about our offshore wind work. I come to this position after working several years in the field as an avian ecologist. And I did want to, I don't really need to do this for you because Dennis has already done it for me, but I just wanted to let you know that I am here as an ecologist. I started my work out in California, working with the San Diego Zoo and their Conservation Institute on San Clemente loggerhead shrikes out on a Navy-owned island, the last ship-to-shore bombardment training facility. And then moved out east to work for Monomoy National Wildlife Refuge on common terns and roseate terns, and have really been in love with the Barrier Island ecosystem on the East Coast ever since. And so that's really what took me back to NC State to work on American oyster catchers. And it's what brought me here to work for Audubon so that I could protect these birds as we build out a clean energy future. So I am now part of the Clean Energy Initiative of National Audubon Society, and we cover the entire United States. I do this work in partnership with John Belak, who's our field manager for the Pacific, Mountain and Central Flyways, and then my boss, Gary George, in the center here, is our director. And then I work on solar and wind in the Mississippi and Atlantic flyways, and I also work on offshore wind on all coasts, really, but primarily in the Atlantic and in the Gulf of Mexico. And as Dennis has already said, we know that climate change is a bird issue. I started my work at NC State actually as a climate change fellow. And so I learned there really just how dire this situation is. And Audubon's own climate science has documented and predicted range losses for 389 species that could lead to their extinction if we fail to address climate change. This graph shows different global warming projections under different emission scenarios. The red line indicates the worst case scenario in which we continue to grow our greenhouse gases at the same rate. The blue line is the ideal scenario in which we significantly reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. And then that yellow line is something you can just forget about. We've already blown past that. It's the prediction of global surface temperature if we magically stopped emitting carbon back in 2020, which we know we didn't do. The northern gannet, one of my favorite marine birds, is an example of a species that is facing extinction as our Earth continues to warm. This map right here shows under our own climate science the current breeding range for northern gannets. This is the predicted range for the species by 2050 if global temperatures reach 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. And while there is still time to make sure that we don't surpass this by a great deal, it's very likely we will reach a 1.5 degree Celsius warming scenario above pre-industrial levels. Because this system acts on a delay. So even if we were to stop emitting carbon today, we would still likely reach this scenario. Now, if we fail to take action, we may reach a scenario in which we have reached 3.0 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels by 2080, at which point we really have no range left, or almost no range left, for northern gannets. So we need to act now to mitigate these effects, but we also need to acknowledge that climate change is and will continue to affect this species moving forward. And therefore, it's also essential that we work on limiting other pressures on these populations that would be additional to climate change. This plot here shows our energy consumption trends. As you can see, our energy consumption has slowed a little bit, but it's still going up, and that leads to more greenhouse gas emissions. This plot here is showing how much of our energy consumption comes from electricity. So keep in mind that even using electricity contributes to greenhouse gas emissions if the source of that electricity doesn't come from renewable energy. So if we're doing our best and we're buying electric vehicles and we're using electric power, that is still contributing to greenhouse gases if we're not using renewable sources for that. In 2020, 80% of our energy came from non-renewable sources. So we really need to increase our generation of wind and solar in order to achieve our clean energy goals. And I should also note that without storage generation for these projects, when you see a nameplate capacity on these projects, we're really only going to be able to generate about 20 to 30% of that nameplate capacity. So in addition to building out more solar and wind, we also need to build out solar storage and wind storage technology so that we can really grasp the full power of those projects. This map shows the US wind energy resources, or the potential at rotor swept height. So the darker colors suggest higher renewable or higher wind energy potential at the rotor swept zone. And I put this here because you can see the really dark colors are offshore, right? They're in federal waters. Most of them up, a great deal of wind energy potential is up north in the Northeast. So it's just to emphasize that offshore wind is really going to be an important part of our renewable energy portfolio in order to reach our goals of net zero emissions. And with that in mind, Audubon supports offshore wind energy and transmission that is sited and operated properly to avoid, minimize, and mitigate effectively for the impacts on birds, other wildlife, and the places they need. So that sited and operated properly to avoid the impacts is a really important piece of this. And I'll talk a little bit more about how we ensure that that's happening moving forward. Before we get there, I do want to just give you a little bit of background on where offshore wind is currently in the United States, and specifically in your region. So given this critical need for offshore wind, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, or BOEM, as we call them, has been busy defining areas for potential offshore wind development in the United States. This is a map, generally speaking, of where the offshore wind areas are under consideration right now. Some of this is adjusted a little bit. In New York, we have the wind energy areas have now been designated as lease areas, and I'll show you a little bit more about those. But this is a long process, this process by which we get to actual leasing of renewable energy. Right now, we only have one project in federal waters, and it's 2 turbines owned by Dominion Energy off the coast of Virginia. The project that is off of Block Island is in state waters, and so wasn't actually permitted by BOEM. So we're still yet to have a utility scale project in federal waters. Vineyard Wind 1 has been approved, but it hasn't actually been built yet or broken ground. So this process can take several years, and there are several different touch points at which we can engage with BOEM and provide public comments. I don't know if you can see my mouse right now. Can I see a nod if you can see a mouse? Yes, oh good, a mouse, okay, great. So right here, when they initiate the lease process or when BOEM starts considering they might want to do some offshore wind, they have the potential to put out a request for information or an RFI. They did that recently in the Gulf of Mexico. We provided comment for that. They'll then identify call areas and will receive comments on those call areas, and at which point they then whittle that area down a little bit based on the comments they receive into what's considered a wind energy area. And then that's whittled down a little bit further into actual lease areas. And at each of these touch points, there are opportunities for public comment. So especially here and here, and the big one is right here. So after several years of surveys, environmental surveys, surveys at which the developers also evaluate view sheds, and all sorts of user impacts in addition to environmental concerns. They create a construction and operation plan right here. We review the construction and operation plan when it's made public, and we provide comment on that to BOEM before they develop their environmental impact statement. And then they draft an environmental impact statement, and we comment on that draft environmental impact statement. So there's several points at which we can provide input to BOEM. And there are several ways of doing that. We can provide oral comments at hearings, which I've done several times for projects in the Northeast. And I've also contributed to some public comment letters. Currently in waters off the coast of Connecticut and southern New England, there are quite a few leases going on. New York recently whittled down their call areas and wind energy areas into actual leases. So there are several leases. These green and light blue areas are actual lease designations. This one here has been purchased by Equinor and is currently undergoing its environmental impact assessment by BOEM, and should have an draft EIS out, within a year for us to evaluate. You have Revolution Wind here, which you might have heard of, South Fork Wind here, Vineyard Wind, and this section over here of Vineyard Wind is Park City Vineyard Wind 1 or Vineyard Wind South, and part of that energy is going to Connecticut. So this is the area where Connecticut is going to be receiving its energy from if it gets built. And there is a long drawn out process that, as I've said, for getting to this stage. So we didn't just all of a sudden have a bunch of lease areas out of the blue. BOEM did go through several periods of public comment. So the original areas for consideration in the New York Bight were these areas in blue. This year, actually, BOEM's been working very fast under the Biden administration to move leases forward instead of just letting them sit there, because this administration believes very strongly in renewable energy and the need to fight climate change, which is a good thing. But it means I have a very big job ahead of me. So this year they moved these call areas into these wind energy areas in green under consideration. And has since decided not to progress the fairways north and south areas, which are closest to Long Island, for consideration. They may still consider them in the future, but they're not under consideration right now. And they are working on a final sale notice that they will publish shortly that will include these little lease sales in I guess a seafoam green is what this color is. And the same process for the wind energy areas off of southern New England and off of Massachusetts. So this was the big call area, or excuse me, request for information area. They then moved it to this call area here. This call area then became a little bit smaller under the wind energy area. And then they turned it into these different leases, and they've all since been sold. And about half of these that are shown on the screen here have already produced construction and operation plans. And BOEM is currently reviewing those construction and operation plans to produce environmental impact statements. South Fork Wind and Vineyard Wind 1, which is the upper half of this polygon, have both been approved. And so they should move forward with their leases in due time. So when we're thinking about how these projects might impact the environment and specifically impact birds, there are a couple issues that we consider. And remember, we're thinking about birds. We want to remember that the greatest impact that birds are dealing with right now is climate change, right? That's the biggest impact we're dealing with now. So we really need renewable energy. But at the same time, we also want to limit other impacts to birds so that we give our birds a fighting chance at dealing with climate change. So when we're considering impacts to birds, we're thinking about three main issues. One is, how sensitive is the population to take in general, right? So if we're dealing with endangered species like red knot or piping plover or roseate tern, those are very vulnerable species. So any amount of take to those populations is really important to mitigate. And then we also want to consider which birds are just more likely to interact with these projects and how they're going to do it. So one way is through direct impacts like collision, which I don't think needs a whole lot of explanation. And then the other impact is displacement or some type of habitat loss. And that happens for birds that are maybe less likely to be impacted directly by collision, but that tend to avoid areas that are built with offshore wind. And if projects are sited in places that those birds really need or typically forage in, that can cause habitat loss. And so that has implications. And then there are also potential impacts for birds that may be commuting in the area to foraging grounds and now choose to divert their routes around the wind energy areas to avoid the turbines, and now have some sort of energetic cost with adjusting that movement. So we're thinking of all of those different things, and we're looking at endangered species. We're looking at birds that frequent the area. Northern gannets aren't endangered, but they are using the areas that we're considering for building quite frequently. And then we're also thinking about land bird migrants that are transatlantic migrants that are jumping across the ocean to get to wintering grounds. So even small passerines are things that we're really concerned about. Now, in general, those types of birds are going to be flying at fairly high altitudes. But in the case that, there's some weird weather event or something happens that draws them further into the turbines, we want to make sure that we're accounting for any of those odd events that might happen. We've learned a lot about how offshore wind impacts birds from offshore wind in the UK. And so that's how we know about how northern gannets respond to offshore wind. That's how we know that kittiwake are really sensitive to displacement from offshore wind. That's how we know that terns are somewhat vulnerable to collision with offshore wind. But there's still a lot we don't know, and a lot that's really unique to offshore wind in the United States. And one of those factors is that we're dealing with bigger turbines than we ever did before. The largest turbine in the water currently is 8 megawatts, and that's in Europe. The turbines currently offshore in Rhode Island and Virginia are only 6 megawatts, and we're expecting 12 to 15 megawatt turbines for Vineyard Wind Farm. So that's a big difference. So one of the ways that we evaluate these, so we do really want to worry about how birds are moving across these areas. So we're looking at transatlantic migration, and considering when birds are moving across the ocean and what routes they're taking, so that we can understand what kind of mitigation measures might be necessary. And then we also think about other concerns like underwater noise that can come from the turbines as they're operating, that can come from the turbines certainly as they're being constructed and put into the ground. A lot of underwater noise is created when piles are driven into the ground. That's a really big source of underwater noise. And there are studies that suggest that birds like Atlantic puffin and other diving birds react to underwater noise and are sensitive to underwater noise. And we can also have underwater noise from increased ship traffic from the construction and maintenance of these projects. And then that underwater noise and the electromagnetic fields that come from the cables also have implications for the fish that our birds rely on. And so how do those birds then respond to those changes in fish movements? And we also need to keep in mind implications for coastal nesting habitats and any benthic communities that provide bird food. And we have quite a few important bird areas off the coast of Connecticut and New York. All of Long Island's southern shore is an important bird area. And so we certainly make sure that BOEM and the developers are aware of these areas and are avoiding hitting the most important parts of these important bird areas. So we make sure that when they're routing their onshore cable and onshore facilities, that they're going in areas that are already developed. So even though we've learned a lot from these about what the impacts look like from turbine development in the offshore wind turbine development in the UK, there's still a lot we don't know. And so we consider adaptive management as a really important part of this, because there's some things we're not going to know until turbines go in the water, because we can't. So we take the steps to avoid and minimize as best we can, and that means using spatial planning processes to site offshore wind the way, in part, how BOEM is already doing it, but there are ways that that process can be improved. So we try and avoid high conflict areas through those processes. But then there are also ways that we can operate turbines so that we minimize impacts to birds. So minimize lighting, make sure that there are minimal perching opportunities that would draw birds like pelicans and gulls and cormorants to the turbines, because they would like those perching opportunities. And then also making sure that the construction timing is timed to conflict as little as possible with the birds that are using the area. But then moving forward, we need to inform what kinds of processes might be needed in the future. So as these projects are built out, we encourage regulators and developers to engage in multiple types of studies to understand preemptively what is there, and then be able to pair that with how birds are using the areas after construction, so that we know if there's displacement happening. One of the ways that developers and contractors are doing that is through digital aerial surveys. And in the past, we've mostly used boat and human aerial surveys. BOEM funded a huge survey a huge effort to put a bunch of boat and aerial survey work together to create these spatial maps along the Atlantic coast. And if you ever need to look these up, these are called MDAT models, and you can look at the Northeast portal to see these, to engage with these maps more thoroughly if you're interested. And this was really a good initial process for identifying which areas would be least conflict for siting. Rhode Island, also through the ocean SAMP process, did a really great job with Peter Payton at University of Rhode Island to identify which areas were least conflict for siting offshore wind offshore Rhode Island. And that green area is what then eventually became South Fork and Revolution Wind. And you can even see in these maps, these lighter areas are the areas of least conflict. And so you can see here is Revolution Wind, South Fork Wind is right in here, and it's all brightly colored because it is an area of less dense bird use based on their aerial surveys. Aerial surveys don't do a great job of catching bird use during migration. So if a bird is just passing through, you're not going to see it on aerial transect surveys, no matter how frequently you're able to do them. And so we rely on other types of other tools to figure out how birds are using the wind energy areas. And we use different types of telemetry. One is through VHS. And that uses these towers that pick up on bird tags as they move by. So this little bird is carrying a nano tag, and as the bird flies within the range of this tower, the tower picks it up and logs it. Larger birds like gannets can get GPS satellite backpacks on them, and that captures even more fine scale movement through the area and doesn't rely on a tower in order to capture the movement. So these two different ways of capturing bird movement through the area. It's also really good for capturing movement of terns when you can't tell the difference between and a roseate tern from an aerial survey. Some of these digital aerial surveys can get at that, but it's not super reliable yet. These maps right here are through GPS telemetry technology. So you're seeing essentially the density of different or high use areas of these different bird species. You can see that for the most part, these areas for expected for development are outside of high use areas for red-throated loon and surf scoter. And even for northern gannet, you can see that they're really conflicting a little bit more with wind energy areas. But if you look, New York Bight really is only developing the areas that are further outside. They are developing this little section, I think, right here, but for the most part, their wind energy areas or their lease areas that they identified within the wind energy areas are further away from these high use areas, which I think is a great thing. But then that's where the minimization and mitigation measures come in, is where those areas can't be completely avoided. Radar technologies, including marine radar, can also help us to understand migratory patterns. So for nocturnal migrants, we can't tag all of them. We can't tag every species. It's just not, it's not possible. And so radar can really help be a complementary tool so that we can see trends in movement and flux of birds moving through the sky at different times. And that can help us to inform when we might need little different mitigation strategies or minimization strategies, like smart curtailment. You know, kind of like we ask cities to turn off their lights during peak migration, we could potentially ask developers to, when we know really fine scale of when birds are about to come through, we can ask them, all right, tonight's the night, turn off your turbines. And then before turbines go in the water, we're doing a lot of work to finalize or to refine what we call collision risk models. So we're taking 3D bird movement of seabirds off the Pacific coast. We're taking MODIS or VHS telemetry data, VHF, excuse me, telemetry data, and using that to understand more fine scale movements of roseate terns. And we're using that, scientists are using that type of data to really understand better the flight behaviors of these birds and how that might put them at higher risk with turbines. What we need to keep in mind is that these are really just hypotheses based on what we see birds doing away from turbines. And so we still need to prove or test those hypotheses when turbines go in the water through collision detection technology. And this is a big one because it's not something that's actually ready for offshore yet. This is a technology that is still in development. There are several scientists that are working on technologies that could be used as collision detection technology in the offshore. But this is something Audubon is really pushing BOEM and other regulators to enforce, because otherwise there will be no way for understanding what the actual take is in the offshore environment from direct collisions. And understanding this technology and further refining it could allow us to inform some of that smart curtailment that I was thinking of. So if we've got radar, that can kind of tell us trends when we would want to turn off turbines, but these, but we can also do curtailment for a specific bird, right? So in onshore wind facilities, this has actually been used and it's reduced the number of collisions with large birds. But in the offshore, it's just not ready yet. There are a whole number of things that make this a little bit more difficult. And one of them is just how harsh the sea environment is. But we are working with our partners. We're working with BOEM. We have we do talk a lot with the agency and have really productive conversations and push them as best we can. So we do work closely with the industry. We work closely with the government. and we work closely with you guys, our network, to make sure that we're supporting and moving forward a responsible offshore wind energy industry in an efficient manner, so that we can both have wind energy and have the birds that we love and the ecosystem that we love. So one of the ways that we engage with the industry, we have direct conversations, but we also engage through comment letters, and those are well responded to. It seems like this tedious process where we're just writing these letters, but they actually do get do have use. We've also provided best management practices to the agency, and worked with a lot of our partners through National Wildlife Federation, TNC, NRDC, a coalition of other ENGOs, in order to engage on this process and make that case stronger. But we're really the leader on the bird piece. We also engage on state level advisory panels. So Corey Folsom O'Keefe serves on the Commission on Environmental Standards. Jillian Liner from Audubon, New York, and I both serve on NYSERDA's Environmental Technical Working Group, or the ETWIG, if you might have heard it called that. And then also from NYSERDA has generated, and from the ETWIG, has generated the Regional Wildlife Science Entity, and my supervisor, Gary George, serves on that as one of the steering committee members. And then we serve on several NGO coalitions, one on the Atlantic, but also in the Gulf and in the Pacific. And my boss also serves on the board of the American Wind and Wildlife Institute. So we have a great deal of engagement points and points of contact for this work. I do want to lift up the New York State's Environmental Technical Working Group, because it provides such an excellent example of a government-supported, institutionalized stakeholder engagement process. This type of process, which New York and New Jersey were the first, are two good examples of this type of process. Because of this, they were the first two states to mandate minimum funding requirements for offshore wind lease applicants. So they contribute to a pool of for research and monitoring for offshore wind development. So all developers that are procuring contracts to deliver wind to these states through offshore wind development have to contribute 10,000 megawatts to fisheries and environmental monitoring per megawatt. So it's a big deal, and it's great fun to make sure that we can understand properly the impacts. And this coordinated, standardized wildlife monitoring across the region is super important, so that we can set stakeholder expectations and provide regulatory certainty to developers. And it ultimately helps us to reach our clean energy goals in a manner that is both better for birds and more efficient. And Audubon's engagement in these groups is already having an influence over the outlook for offshore wind. So I'd really like to end by providing you with some of those uplifting examples. One is what I've already mentioned, the Regional Wildlife Science Entity. It's an effort by New York and Massachusetts states and various other industry partners, environmental NGOs, state and federal agency partners, to address the needs to understand the interactions between the natural environment, wildlife, and offshore wind developments. It is a direct result of the stakeholder-driven technical working group that Audubon participates in. So it's a really great result. We finally have a coordinator for that group, and so it's already doing work to create little caucuses, and so it's got different caucuses for the NGO groups that are involved. It's got a different caucus for the industry partners together. So I imagine that hopefully soon in the future, when they get to creating the avian panel, that we'll be a part of that as well. They are looking for a new name because it really isn't just a regional wildlife science entity. It's supposed to be informing how we look at offshore wind across the United States. So if anybody has a great name idea, I'm sure we'll take it. I'm sure we'll take it into consideration. So keep that in mind. But it is for beyond just New England, and so I'm looking forward to seeing it grow. Our involvement in the stakeholder process for Icebreaker, which was proposed for Lake Erie, led to a really big breakthrough where Ohio required that the project use collision detection and radar technologies. And this is really important for offshore wind and birds in the Great Lakes, but it's also a key catalyst for the accelerated development of collision detection technology. So more collision detection technology work is happening because it's required for this project. And it's also provides a precedent by which I can sort of hold BOEM's feet to the fire in trying to move this as a requirement in the federal waters offshore. Our work in the Migratory Bird Treaty Act is also a huge win. We can't protect birds offshore if they don't have federal protections. And right now, there is a process going to collect comments on the reversal of the Trump era rule, and on a potential incidental take permit, so that each industry would be responsible for outlining how it would minimize and mitigate take of migratory birds. And that's something we've never had before. So that's really huge. And we helped the Biden administration to focus on siting and permitting offshore wind in a way that's environmentally responsible and provides sufficient protections for birds. So this language is in here in large part because of our work. And the agency also directly responded to our comments for the Vineyard Wind 1 when we commented on their supplemental environmental impact statement. They came back to us in the final environmental impact statement with a great deal of improvement to their mitigation requirements for the Vineyard Wind 1 project. So they will now be installing MODIS towers with 150 MODIS tags expected to be deployed at least on birds. They're requiring FAA-approved ADLS lighting, which activates only as a hazard is approaching or as a plane is approaching, so that minimizes hazards to birds. And it ensures that all data will be publicly available, which is a really important part, right? If they're collecting all this data, but they don't have to share it with us, that doesn't really hold the industry accountable. So this isn't all we want, but it's a great deal better than it was when we received the supplemental EIS. So we're really happy with those improvements. Our work with clean energy up in the Gulf of Maine led a few concerned donors to pool support for a PhD student to track movements of seabirds that nest in the Gulf of Maine. So we now have $75,000 to fund this work, where we are putting GPS tags on Atlantic puffin, on Leach's storm petrel, and Arctic tern, so that we can track their movements within the Gulf of Maine and beyond if they go beyond that area with these tags on their backs. And then they will also be using this money to fund some MODIS towers out in the Gulf of Maine on islands out there, so that we can contribute to the work being done on smaller birds that have tags on them as well. And Connecticut has done a lot of great work as well, specifically. So I think you guys can be proud of yourselves as a state for having these expectations of 2,000 megawatts and now 4,000 megawatts, mandating that you now have a commission on environmental standards that Corey Folsom O'Keefe sits on, and that you have wind procured already. So you already have a portion of 704 megawatts coming to you from Revolution Wind. And you have Park City Wind is going to be, I think I misspoke earlier because I said Park City is where you guys are getting your power. You're getting your power from Revolution Wind, but Park City Wind is leading to a facility in Bridgeport that is going to, help drive your economy. So I think these are all really great contributions that you guys are making. But there's still more we can be doing, right? So at all of these checkpoints, I reach out to Dennis to see if you guys want to sign on to our public comments. And he's always, or usually pretty happy to do so. I haven't come to a point yet where he has disagreed with the things I put in these letters, but I would welcome any additions. That one. And I want to encourage you to reach out to the Clean Energy Initiative if you have any questions about projects or concerns. If you're interested in getting involved further in commenting, there are public hearings, and you should reach out to Laura McCarthy. I have materials that I can provide her for all of you, but I would get in contact with her first. Also look out for emails from me for those comment opportunities. And keep letting me know what the key bird issues are. So if there's a project that comes up, I would really love to hear it in advance. If there's a concern that you have that is specific to the project that we may not have brought up before, or even if we have and you're just not sure, I want to make sure that I speak to what's important to you all. And you can continue to advocate for state and local policies that help to ensure a positive future for birds through renewable energy. And, I think that's a really big piece. So there's a lot of different ways we can do it with offshore wind and with other types of renewable energy, making sure that that there's a path forward for us to have a clean energy future. There are a few upcoming opportunities I want to point you to. You will eventually have some state coastal consistency reviews. So the state, even for these projects that have been permitted or that are in permitting process by BOEM, the state has some jurisdiction over whether or not it's consistent with their environmental standards. So there's opportunities there. There are upcoming comment periods, hopefully not until the new year. Right now we're commenting on Atlantic shores, and we should have in New Jersey, we should have a little bit of a break after that. But you should keep fighting to procure more offshore wind. You still have to reach that 4,000 megawatt total. So keep working toward that. And then I also want to let you know that we have a solar energy webinar tomorrow. So John and I, and also Gary Moody, who works on distributed solar, will be giving a presentation tomorrow night at 7 p.m. Eastern. And I can share the link in the chat after we finish up. But that'll be pretty neat too. And with that, I'll take any questions.
Thanks, Shilo. Not everybody knows that Laura McCarthy is the network engagement coordinator for Audubon, New York and Audubon, Connecticut. And her email address is laura.mccarthy@audubon.org. I have a question about Park City.
Yes.
What is Park City doing? They're not building wind turbines in Long Island Sound.
No. Oh gosh, no. No, nobody's building turbines in Long Island Sound. I think that would be a terrible investment. They'd never get that permitted. Let's see. Let me go back to our map here. Easier
if anybody else has questions, at the bottom of your screen is a icon for reactions. click on that and raise your hand.
Okay, so Park City Wind is going in right here. And you can see Martha's Vineyard as a little checkpoint there. So that can help you figure out where we are on the map. But this is where it is. It's far outside of Long Island Sound. And if I show you even the further out view where we've got all of the things permitted. So here's Long Island. Here's that whole wind energy area south of Massachusetts, and Park City, I think, is like right here. Yeah.
And it's called Park City because Bridgeport is the staging area for it.
Oh, is that the fun name for Bridgeport? Is it okay?
Yeah.
Local name. All right, great. See, Carl has his hand up.
It's my understanding that Bridgeport is going to be the terminus for the cable that comes from the wind farm out off Martha's Vineyard there, and the cable will come down through Long Island and then turn into Bridgeport, and the final connection will be built to carry the current from that cable into the UI and Eversource network for distribution throughout the state.
Yeah, I think so. I believe that is happening. There are two cables that will likely be coming to Connecticut, and one of them is as of right now, right? I actually hope there will be more because I want you guys to get more clean energy from these projects. But one of those is going to be from Revolution Wind, and then you're also going to get potentially a cable from Beacon Wind, which is also off here. And part of Beacon Wind is going to New York at Astoria in Queens, and part of it is hopefully going to go to Connecticut, or at least be routed through Connecticut. And so that means that you're going to have a cable that runs through the sound to get to Astoria, and then might split and come in through Connecticut. So you will likely have cables going through Long Island Sound, yes. Keep in mind that there are underground cables in Long Island Sound already. They're just not for offshore wind. But there are, I think, communication cables in Long Island Sound. Equinor is the company that is doing that work, and they're right now surveying the area. I even got a picture from, I don't know if you know Joan Walsh from Mass Audubon, but she sent me a photo when she was out at Great Gull Island of the survey boat going by. And so, you know, I collaborate with them quite a bit. And so she sent me that photo. So there's survey work going out. We are speaking to Equinor about that process. Audubon Connecticut is speaking to them. Connecticut Audubon, Mass Audubon, all of these groups are working together to let Equinor know what the bird concerns are in Long Island Sound. But there won't be turbines. There'll just be cables going underwater, which are still going to have an impact. It's just a very different impact.
Julie, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question, or do you want me to ask?
Great, thank you, Dennis. Actually, I think Shilo just answered it, which was about the transmission from the turbines to the mainland. So I think you just covered that. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Okay, Jeff, you want to unmute yourself?
Yeah, I had a question regarding the MODIS system. There's a problem with it to track movements of birds offshore due to the lack of offshore towers. Can they be put on the turbine towers themselves?
Yeah, Jeff has been very bad and has been texting me during my presentation.
Not texting.
Sending me distracting chats. Yes, so they can potentially be put not on the turbines themselves, but on the platforms. They're not nearly as tall as the turbines, but they can be put on the platforms. And we are pushing for those. So Vineyard Wind is supposed to install Modus towers on their platforms. Block Island has them on their platforms. And there is a study out by URI and BOEM that that discusses a little bit about the functionality of those towers. So there are some complications when putting them on the turbine platforms, but they can certainly be resolved, I think. And then we also try to get those the problem also with Modus is that doesn't help you see how bird movement is changing in response to the turbines if you don't have those Modus towers out before the turbines go into water. So the bigger challenge really is getting them onto a buoy and getting that buoy, which has a lot more movement, to reliably pick up signal.
Can you explain a little bit more about what a Modus tower is?
Yeah,
in
I
case
can.
people don't know?
So for anybody who's ever heard of telemetry work where people go out and track animals with this little antenna, you get a tag on an animal and you go around and you have an antenna and you're trying to pick up a signal. And generally you want to triangulate that signal. So before I came to Audubon, I was working for the state of Rhode Island, and they put trackers on their New England cottontail. And so they have technicians that they hire to go out and track the rabbits or the cottontails and to make sure they're still alive, and see where they are. And on San Clemente Island, there's a long-standing project to track the San Clemente Island foxes. And so people go out and do very serious hiking to track these little island foxes. So these kinds of studies happen all over the place with these little handheld antenna. And you have to go find three different points or 2 different points so that you can triangulate your area and pinpoint where that animal actually was. A Modus tower just stands still. It's this very tall tower with an antenna on it. And you're using the Modus towers in different, you install them in different places along the coastline or throughout the United States. There's a whole network of them. And they're just these passive radio receivers. And so animals can have these tags on them and get picked up by these radio receivers. And that allows you to pick up animals that are moving greater distances so that you couldn't feasibly do that work with a little handheld device and go out and catch it because it's going all over the country, right? So it's really great for migration studies. But like Jeff said, if there isn't a tower out in the middle of the ocean, then you don't get movement in the middle of the ocean, or you can't really pinpoint or triangulate the point of that animal. So part of the work that we need to do in order to better inform offshore wind development is deploying Modus in the offshore environment. And there are several people working to do that in both Atlantic coasts and in the Pacific coasts as well, actually, because a lot of those seabirds are pretty tiny. So even though they don't have a lot of transoceanic movement for land birds, or it's not as much in the Pacific, they're still dealing with a lot of seabirds, and some of those seabirds aren't that big.
Thank you. I wanted
course.
to ask if you'd heard about the research that's just been released in the UK about brown crabs migrating from England up to Scotland along the coast. And the males, when they come to the cables that go from wind turbines to the land seem to be sort of mesmerized by the electromagnetic radiation in the cables, and I don't know if they fall in love with the cable or whatever it is. They seem to be stopping there, and they're worried about there being plenty of females up in the north, but no males to mate with them. And this was a concern, not in terms of birds, but in terms of fishermen that catch the crabs.
Yeah, that seems like a pretty big one. I have not read that. That sounds like a fascinating study. I have to admit, I let other partners advocate for our benthic communities and our fish communities. So I am not up on the research on the crabs in the UK, unfortunately. But I do know that the electromagnetic fields are a concern for benthic communities and for fish. And that does relate to birds here, because those fish could be, their movements and their use of the environment might change. And that, if the birds aren't able to change with them, what does that do? Or do the birds change with them, right? So, yeah, I mean, EMF is a real thing. It's not pretend. So it's definitely something that our partners advocate to mitigate for. Yeah, it's certainly a big concern by fisheries as well. Yeah.
Well, it could be a concern for birds too, if they were crabs that birds might eat.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Does
Yeah, so there's
anyone
all
else
sorts
have,
of factors.
does anyone else have a question? Hearing none, I'll thank you, Shilo, for your presentation. Very enjoyable, and we'll look forward to seeing people in our next meeting. Check our website for the lineup and to register for the Zoom meetings. With that, I'll bid you all good night, and thanks, Shilo, very much.
Thank you.